Okay, well, to everyone who's already gathered with us, I'm very pleased to start off 2022 in our virtual program series with such a wonderful program. Today, we welcome Naomi Tomky, who in her own words, uses her unrelenting enthusiasm as an eater, photographer, and writer to propel herself around the world. That's the good life, even if it took a lot of hard work to get there. She's an editor, photographer, and writer, the author of the Pacific Northwest Seafood Cookbook, and has written about food and travel for many publications, including Saveur, which I practiced pronouncing before we started, the New York Times, Food and Wine, BBC Travel, quite a few airline magazines, including Norwegian Air and Malaysia Air, apparently, Jewish in Seattle Magazine and Seattle Magazine, a bit closer to home. Naomi has also contributed to various guides and guidebooks, as well as Lucky Peach's book, All About Eggs. She's won multiple awards for her writing, including a Lowell Thomas Award for culinary travel writing in 2019, and the Association of Food Journalists Best Food and Travel Writing Award for 2016. And as she and I discussed, we almost worked together at Seattle Weekly. We nearly overlapped many years ago in 2006. So we have a journalistic alma mater in common. So Naomi has also worked as a contributing editor for Seattle's Child magazine, she's the Seattle restaurant writer for Gaio.com. She's an instructor who's taught travel and food writing and cooking, and is a recipe developer and tester as well. So without further ado, extremely pleased to welcome to the JFS virtual stage, Naomi Tomky.
Hi guys, thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Neil, for that lovely introduction. I have written for a lot of places, and as you mentioned, I mostly write about food and travel, but whenever I find an interesting story, I also try to work in a little bit of Jewish life into my pieces, and especially Jewish food history and culture, which is where I came up with this topic that we're going to talk about today, about Jews and Chinese food on Christmas. And I'm going to go ahead and get started, but you are very welcome to ask questions either throughout. I think writing them in the chat is going to be the easiest, as I try to maneuver all the different pieces on my screen with the slideshow and the Zoom and the chat, and I will try to keep an eye on it and answer them as they come in. Like the first one where Judy asked which airline has the best food. Well, what I will tell you is that I write for the airline magazines, not about the airlines. But in my personal experience, for our honeymoon, we flew Emirates Air, and I remember that being very good. So that is my quick answer there. I'm actually going to kick off my little talk here with a video, and I will warn you, because technology, I don't know how it will look on your screens, but I will explain the piece that I'm trying to emphasize afterwards, so if you can't see, don't worry about it. It'll just be a few seconds, and then I will tell you what is happening. Oh, now I got to figure out how to move to the next screen.
Hey, I said no shrimp. I'm kosher.
You know, in the Chinese calendar, I'm a monkey.
Okay, man, this gesehen so viel Jeden in Schul. Das ist ein Schablon.
Okay, so this is a Yiddish comedy show, and they're in a Chinese restaurant on Christmas, and one guy says to the other, "I haven't even seen this many Jews in synagogue. It's so," and the other guy responds, "It's so cliche." And so that is where I came up with the title of my talk here. Jews and Chinese food on Christmas, the roots of the great cliche. So how many of you guys can raise your hands? I have you on grid view. How many of you guys grew up eating Chinese food? Almost everyone there. What about eating Chinese food on Christmas? Yeah, so that's a little bit less. I also didn't grow up eating Chinese food on Christmas. I came into the idea of Chinese food on Christmas as a thing as an adult, in part because I grew up in Seattle, where that wasn't as big of a deal. It's really something that came out of the urban centers of Jewishness, New York, LA, to a lesser extent, Chicago and San Francisco. But as an adult, I've adopted it for many of the same reasons that the generations before me did, because it's convenient, it's delicious, and best of all, it's open. So the restaurant that you see pictured here on the side is where I went this year on Christmas. My family was driving down from Whistler and through Vancouver, and we stopped at a Uyghur restaurant, which is Muslim Chinese food. And we chose this one because they were not busy. They were open, but not crowded. And that has really been the biggest deterrent in recent years, is that what was once a regional cultural thing has become a larger phenomenon. And now the Cantonese restaurants that people have been going to on Christmas for years are packed on Christmas Day. So to totally butcher an old saying, when New York sneezes, American Jewish culture catches a cold, or maybe it says Gesundheit, but this has become an enormous thing. And so to look at that, I have a few little things. I'm sorry, I'm doing too many things here, and we're just gonna leave that there. All right. There is a meme that sort of illustrates this, that goes around every Christmas goes around the internet. It's about a decade old, and every year it gets passed around Facebook and Instagram and all that. And it says, the Chinese Restaurant Association of the United States would like to extend our thanks to the Jewish people. We do not completely understand your dietary customs, but we are proud and grateful that your God insists you eat our food on Christmas. It's very funny. It's not real, sadly, as much as we would love it to be. But what is real is the trend of people eating Chinese food on Christmas Day. So I have the top chart here is the last 16 years of Google Trends. So this is just how many people are searching for Chinese food all the time on Google. And you can see lots of people love Chinese food. Sadly, there's this huge dip here, which is the beginning of the pandemic. But in general, each year in the early years has sort of a double peak. And that's because the two busiest days of the year for Chinese restaurants are Chinese New Year and Christmas. If you look at the lower graph here, that's just the last 5 years. And the Chinese New Year peak kind of stays the same. Apparently all the Chinese already know where they're going for their big meal. I suppose we would all know where to order our bagels for break the fast. Didn't need to Google that. But you can see that Christmas each year becomes this huge spike, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until just this year it's not as big. Presumably that's a pandemic related thing, but that peak of Christmas is just growing. And as much as I would love that the Jews could take all the credit for driving this enormous trend, the reality is this is because so many other people have started doing the same thing. But before we get to that part of the trend, I thought I would start with the reason that this became a thing in the first place. And it starts with the connection between Jews and Chinese food on an everyday basis. As we saw, a lot of us grew up eating Chinese food. And the basic reasons that Jews love Chinese food is the same basic reasons that all people love Chinese food. It's good, it tends to be affordable, and there's enough that they are often nearby. But when it comes to Jews and Chinese food, that proximity factor tends to get a little bit over-indexed. It's very easy to say that, oh, well, the Jews and Chinese immigrants lived in the same neighborhoods or in the same part of Manhattan, the Lower East Side, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, which is when all of this started. But it's not just that they were near each other, because there were other immigrants there and other immigrant restaurants. There were German restaurants and Italian restaurants. The key was that those restaurants were probably serving big hunks of pork, possibly boiled in milk. And there was probably cheese around, and Chinese food didn't use very much dairy. So that made keeping kosher a lot easier. and they had poultry dishes. And in dishes like fried rice, there was pork, but it was chopped up, and it gave birth to this idea of sort of plausible deniability of the presence of pork in the food, or something that has been dubbed safe trafe. But it wasn't just the food. I mean, it was nice that it made it easier to at least believe they were keeping their dietary restrictions. It was also that they were the two largest non-Christian immigrant groups. And so that meant not only did they have to not stare at big hunks of pork, they also didn't have to stare at big pictures of Jesus, which is still something that I really appreciate today when I go out for dinner. So the lack of Christian iconography or, Catholic saints staring down at them was nice. But also both the Chinese and Jews of that era in that place were on the receiving end of a lot of hate from the larger world. And some of that has to do with what was going on in the world, but in terms of what they were doing in restaurants, really specifically, it had to do with who was immigrating that made the Chinese so welcoming to the Jews. The Jewish immigrants at that time came to live in the US. They were not planning on going back to the old country. The old country was not planning on having them back. And the Chinese were often actually moved out from the West Coast. They had come and built the railways in California and then moved to the East Coast and were then running restaurants. And so they also were planning to build a life in America. Meanwhile, the Italians had come to work. They didn't need to meet their neighbors. They didn't need to learn the customs. They were going to come, and then they were going to make some money, and then they were going to go back to Italy where they could get all the pasta that they needed. So the Italian restaurants were catering towards Italians who wanted to keep their Italian customs and didn't have any interest in doing something else. The Italian restaurants catered to the Italians. The Chinese restaurants were happy to cater to the Jews. And in fact, if you look at old issues of the Vorwärts or other Yiddish newspapers at the time, there's Chinese restaurants advertising to Jews in them. So coming back to the idea of Christmas, a guy named Rabbi Joshua Plott, who we'll hear from a bunch in this, wrote a book called A Kosher Christmas and pointed out that Chinese restaurants on Christmas were among the only ones open, but he points out that that is both literally and metaphorically. So Ellen texted and said, when I grew up, the Chinese and Jews were the only ones not celebrating Christmas, and therefore the Chinese restaurants were the only restaurants open on Christmas. And that is part of it. And we are going to talk a lot about how that little piece of it is part of it, but there's a lot more to the story. So we talked about the idea of safe trafe, and actually that is the name of a sociology study that Gay Tuchman and Harry Levine did in the 1990s, where they looked at New York Jews and Chinese food. And so they actually studied, like, why do Jews like Chinese food so much? So we're going to get to Christmas, but first we're going to look at sort of the general idea. And one of the things that they found was that it had to do with feeling that Chinese food was cosmopolitan. It was, we were urbane because we ate Chinese food. So they found a number of third generation Jews spontaneously told us the same thing. The first restaurant I ever went to was Chinese. We never found an Italian American who said that. Well, what you see here is the New Peking restaurant, which is the first restaurant I ever went to when I was 3 days old. And that is a root beer keg on the top of it because it used to be an A&W. And at the bottom of your screen is the restaurant that it now is, which is Ching's Gourmet. And that picture on the right is my daughter, Jordana, at 3 days old, eating at Ching's Gourmet. Or not eating, I was eating. So they found that Jews construed Chinese restaurants as cosmopolitan. For Jews in New York, eating in Chinese restaurants signified that one was not a provincial or parochial Eastern European Jew, not a greenhorn or a hick. In New York City, immigrant Jews, and especially their children and grandchildren, regarded Chinese food as sophisticated and urbane. So then coming back to Christmas, every discussion of this, as Ellen pointed out, begins at the easiest spot. They were the only places open. And that is for sure probably true in some places, but it's not everywhere. And this kind of developed over the years, and there's a lot more interesting pieces of history. And so Rabbi Joshua Plott and many other people point to this article, which is from the 1935 New York Times, as one of the starting points of this tradition being more widely known. It was something that people did because it's what they did. But here, it says Yule stirs Chinese to a Jewish home. And a guy named Engshi Chuk of Newark brought chow mein dinner to a children's home and told fairy tales to the Jewish children. And from there are like bits and pieces of evidence that this happened throughout the years until about the 80s and 90s. And then it just explodes as a known thing. By the 80s and 90s, everyone is just referring to it like it's something that everybody knows, but there's very little written about the tradition in the time leading up to that. And I think a lot of that is that you have, it wasn't, I don't want to say it wasn't cool, but it wasn't something that people were different, and it wasn't something that was as easy to talk about what you were doing. But clearly this was something that spread easily and everyone had glommed onto already by that point. And so looking at why, you can start with the fact that we could just stay home on this holiday that everyone else is out celebrating, but it already feels very mean that we have the world's least useful day off. You can't run any errands because all the stores are closed, and you can't do much fun because everything else is closed too. But what Plott said is that people didn't want to just stay home anyways, because it's the only national holiday that American Jews had a discomfort with because of the very religious underpinnings. So rather than staying home and sulking or feeling idle, they really wanted to get together with their family and friends. And the Chinese restaurants were open, not just in the literal sense, but it's also that being Jewish is constantly being in the minority, and Jews never feel more that way than during the holiday season. We got Santa hiding around every corner. There's red and green baubles hanging from every surface, jingle bells ringing in our ears for months. So like our ancestors who found refuge in the places that didn't have Jesus on the wall, the Chinese restaurant, even though some do decorate for Christmas now, still isn't serving a turkey dinner and eggnog. It's creating a refuge of secularity for us, and helping these two sort of out groups now turn into that in group. The classic Jewish Christmas also includes going to see a movie afterwards, and Plott ascribes that similarly to Lower Manhattan in the early 20th century. And before that even, there were Yiddish theater openings on that day. And then as movie theaters started to open, there would be very affordable Nickelodeon theaters all over the place that were, like Chinese food. They were cheap and they were plentiful and they were nearby. But fast forwarding to more recent times, and while he's not currently the most welcome person everywhere, Woody Allen often had a December movie, which meant that not only could Jews go out for Chinese food and avoid Christmas there, they could hop over to the local multiplex and see a Santa-free film full of just the kind of people that we all grew up with. A Vancouver news piece last year quoted a rabbi named Don Moskovitz about growing up in San Francisco the year that Yenta came out. And he says, "I recall my rabbi stood up and gave a sermon because the entire congregation was there in the theater." So whether on the screen or in the restaurant, even in big cities where Jews might not otherwise be spending so much time with their other tribe members, it became this day where we got to be surrounded by a temporary community. And it's a pretty specific community. I mean, Jews already loved Chinese food because it felt cool and cosmopolitan, and it was what was open, but that's all kind of the easy answer. And the food writer Hannah Raskin, who also shares a Seattle Weekly heritage with Neil and I, and was a mentor of mine becoming a food writer, she actually wrote her thesis on the topic of Jews and Chinese food. And she points out, if that was the only reason that things were open, then why didn't we go fishing and eat at hotel buffets? Or go walk in the Arboretum and eat McDonald's? Because those are also open. Rather, she points out that celebrating, or not celebrating as it were, Chinese food, Christmas with Chinese food, actually engages the two poles of American Jewish culture, New York and Hollywood. In other words, we took back the day. We were no longer excluded. We had our own tradition, and it celebrated exactly what we did best. It was entirely Jewish American. Another thing we're great at as Jews, comedy. There's an old joke that says the Jewish people are 5,000 years old and the Chinese people are 3,000 years old. So what did the Jews eat for those first 2,000 years? I'm going to, again, play a little video for you guys here. And I will, again, explain the part that's important. So if you don't get good sound or video, don't worry about it. Video. And the key part there at the end is that they sing, they can finally see King Kong without waiting in line. They can eat in Chinatown and drink their sweet ass wine. Well, I've pinpointed 2005 as about the last time that without waiting in line can be said about Chinese food and a movie on Christmas. So that's a lovely capsule of the era. And you can see that in these two articles from the New York Times. These are 13 years apart. As America gets less religious in general, everybody wants to eat Chinese food on Christmas. The rabbi, Dan Moskowitz, that I quoted earlier, noted that when I was a kid, nobody was at the Chinese restaurants on Christmas Day except the Jews. But now you have people who are not particularly Christian, but still want to mark the day, or they live in blended, or they have blended families like step parents, and the Chinese restaurant becomes a neutral ground. And so they start joining the crowds there. In 2005, the article says, a wassail to the weary this Christmas. And it's an interview with retail workers in New York City who are working up until Christmas and won't have the time to get back to their families before the holiday. And they interview a cook, and he says, this is the kicker, the end of the article, it all builds up to, he says that he may end up doing what Jewish New Yorkers have done for eons. If I end up eating Chinese food, that sounds good. So 13 years later, you have the article on the right, which is an opinion column by a Chinese American woman that says, nothing is more American than Chinese food on Christmas. And it calls Chinese food an acceptable alternative for anyone looking outside the usual holiday celebrations. And that Chinese restaurants have managed to become as culturally American as milk and cookies for Santa. Again, because it's delicious and it's everywhere, but also it's cool to have a tradition. Unfortunately, that's our tradition. And the lines are frustrating, and they're full of goyim who simply prefer Chinese food rather than needing that refuge from the majority culture. In 2020, the lines stretched for blocks in Seattle's International District. It's been a long wait at Ho Ho, my favorite Cantonese seafood restaurant that I've gone to for Christmas on and off for years, but this was something new. It was hours long, even to pick up takeout I had already called in. So that was actually the topic that I had called Hannah Raskin initially to talk to her about a couple of years ago. And she told me that she takes some offense to this trend of everyone jumping in, that she considers it the one thing that's ours, and that she feels like, you're gonna take that too? She says there's a real cultural significance to what we do. This is the day that we celebrate our identity as American Jews. But the reality is, it's something that's kind of gone the way of the bagel, that outside of New York, if even there, it holds sort of a tenuous connection to the Jewishness in the wider world. And even Rabbi Plott, who wrote A Kosher Christmas, admitted on NPR that Americans eating Chinese food on Christmas had become an American tradition. He says, it's just something that's part of the holiday spirit and part of the season of joy. And it's one of our minor contributions in America to the American way of life. The writer of that Vancouver article that I quoted a few times noted that they have even managed to commercialize Jewish Christmas. I asked Raskin if we needed to start looking around for a new tradition. Perhaps it's time that we went out for Bangladeshi food and went bowling. But she noted that if there's anything that Jews are good at, it's upholding tradition. She didn't think we were going to fight anyone, and that there's a lot of Chinese food and a lot of movies, and probably enough to go around. And she's right. We're definitely good at finding excellent food, and maybe we do need to just shift and look for the Chinese restaurants that nobody else has found yet. And that's kind of the lesson that I have taken away from looking into this. I mean, that's how I ended up at the Uyghur restaurant eating Muslim Chinese food this year. And, you know, when I look back on this, would it even be a Jewish tradition if there wasn't at least like a little bit of extra struggle in there? And then what would we kvetch about then? And that is my chat.
Mentioned Helena Kagan, did she?
Bill, are you mentioning Elena
that.
Kagan?
Yeah, so the Elena Kagan quote
Yep.
where she says, they ask what she's doing for Christmas, and she says, I suspect I'll eat Chinese food and go to a movie. Yeah, and then Schumer seconds that or something. I thought about including it. Let me tell you, there is no shortage of quotes from about the last 40 years about this happening. But before that, there is not a lot of evidence, at least not in English. If I could read Yiddish, I might be able to do better on something in the forwards.
Mm-hmm.
That Vancouver has Adela is saying that Vancouver has some of the best Chinese food in the world. And that is absolutely true. And we always stop for Chinese food in Vancouver, including on Christmas. And that is why I can find interesting things like Muslim Chinese food there, which was absolutely terrific.
Mm-hmm. It's also something that you said, Naomi, I kind of wanted to just pick up on the idea of blended families or interfaith families and how it sort of shakes out. And I am, you know, part of an interfaith family. My wife is not Jewish. And I do think that it will be interesting to see how this and other traditions kind of do or don't survive, adapt, change, you know, in the reality of so much interfaith marriage in American Jewish communities anyway. So
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it like I said multiple times, everyone loves Chinese food, and it makes for that easy answer. You know, you don't have to be on one person's ground or the others. You don't have to sit under the Christmas tree. It just makes that neutral place.
any other comments or questions from folks here? Can Naomi stop screen sharing, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sure that's doable.
Yes. Do I know how? Maybe. I don't.
Well, I also have to say, you feel a lot healthier eating Chinese food on Christmas Day than the usual fare. So I like that part of it.
I think we've
Yeah.
we've undone the screen sharing now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, there's a lot of feasting either way, but it's definitely a little bit lighter, and you don't have to worry about there being a giant ham on the table. Judy, did you have a question?
Well, it's not a question, but it's a comment. I also think nowadays there are a lot of Jewish vegetarians, or people who just don't eat meat, and so Chinese has good options for vegetarians compared to other dishes. So
Absolutely.
anyway, that might be another reason. So
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that there are all those options, the breadth of the options and the ability to adhere to those dietary restrictions is a big part in it, both back when it was just avoiding things that were not kosher, and now. I mean, Chang's Gourmet, the place that I showed that we took my daughter, has a whole vegetarian menu the same size as his regular menu.
Yeah, so Jane mentioned Christmas at Shalom Japan, Williamsburg, and Brooklyn. I think it's Asian food more broadly than just Chinese, for some of the reasons you're saying, that Chinese restaurants may be mod. So other Asian food, other Asian restaurants may be open as well.
Right. And it turns out that we ate things like a big bowl of Japanese soup with matzo balls in it. And it was fusion. It wasn't just Japanese. So everything we had a little bit of Jewish food and a little bit of Japanese food artistically mixed in, and it was really fun.
It's a really great place. I think there's 2 or 3 places in Brooklyn that do that sort of fusion Japanese Jewish place. I think 2 of them might be owned by the same person, but they're so much fun. I mean, it's just so cool to see these things sort of evolve and be played with.
Right.
Someone mentioned the Kung Pao Christmas, which is like a takeover of a Chinese restaurant where they order Chinese food and do a thing. And that is a big thing. Again, that's something that's started sort of around the 90s and has been done in some places every year. They have like Kung Pao comedy. And so again, looking at those, it comes back to those poles of American Jewish culture, and you see us doing the things that we American Jews do, which is, honor comedy and movies and eat Chinese food. Judy, yeah.
I also want to add that there's a Jewish cemetery in Hong Kong. So there are a lot of Jews in Asia that we forget about because our ancestry is more European. But that's a huge Jewish culture.
There absolutely is. And there was a lot of Jews in Shanghai in the kind of leading up to World War II, and a lot of them left around then. And there is still quite a number of Jews in Japan. And certainly in the US, there are tons from various types of blended families or immigrants, there are tons of people who are both Chinese and Jewish. And then this fits right in there. But there's a great essay by a woman named Diane Jacob, whose family was, I believe her family was Iraqi Jews that moved to Shanghai and then on to Vancouver. And she talks about where the Chinese traditions from their heritage mixed in with their Jewish traditions. And I think it was in an issue of Lucky Peach. So it's probably a decade old at this point, but it really stuck with me. It was a wonderful piece. Someone says a large Jewish community grew in Shanghai when other countries wouldn't take them in during the Holocaust. Yeah. So I actually haven't watched it, but my parents watched it and said it was very good. There was just a documentary on PBS, maybe this year or like a year ago, that I've heard great things about, that talks about that.
There are actually several documentaries about that phenomenon. I taught Holocaust studies for many years at Wayne State University in Detroit, and it was very intriguing to learn about the Jewish community in Shanghai, and especially as I wrote, because other countries during the Holocaust wouldn't take them in, and so they were able to go to Shanghai.
Yeah, and Pam recommended The Last Kings of Shanghai, which I've heard wonderful things about as well, and is on my to read list, about Jewish family legacy over in Shanghai over 3 centuries. Thanks so much for sharing that. I really appreciate your guys' input and your comments and questions. It was delightful to share one of my favorite topics with people, especially because, you know, as you see, it is one of those things where it's so easy to say, oh, it's what's there and it's what's open, but there's a lot more fun and interesting nuance to it when you dig in. So yeah, that is the surface area answer, but it's cool to get to go down underneath into the nitty gritty of why.
Thank you.
Oh, Judy?
Well, have you ever toured China? Because I know that their regions all have very different cuisines, and they're mostly vegetable oriented because the meat is just chopped up in tiny pieces and, you know, thrown in. So tell me, I'd love to hear about your visiting and touring China.
So I have been to Shanghai, or I've been to a couple places in China. I've been to Shanghai and Beijing and Hong Kong and Hangzhou and a few other places. And today it's very easy to get whatever you would want. Certainly vegetarian cuisine, definitely to order things without pork. I will say that my grandmother tells the story about going to China, and I would guess this would have been around the mid 80s, maybe the late 70s. And she said it was very difficult because while it would all be vegetables, it would all be cooked in lard. And so she did not keep kosher, but she did say that there were people in her group that did, and they would sort of run into things where they had to decide if they were going to just have rice or see if they could talk to someone about getting just steamed vegetables, because so much of what would seem on its surface to be a vegetarian dish was actually cooked in pork fat. So Rosalind asked if I have visited other countries, have I found that Jews in those countries gravitate towards Chinese or Asian food on Christmas? You know, I have visited a lot of other countries, and all the Jews I've ever met anywhere have loved Chinese food, but I haven't always been around on Christmas. What I will say is that it depends a lot on the assimilation of the people in the country that you're in, because I know, for example, the 2 countries I've spent a significant amount of time in are Uruguay and Ecuador. And in both of those countries, and actually in Peru as well, the Chinese immigrants are extremely, or the one-time Chinese immigrants, the people of Chinese heritage, are extremely assimilated in terms of, much like here now, they all celebrate Christmas. And like all of these Chinese restaurants, the owners, I would say 90% of them are probably Christian now. But because this has become a tradition, they do stay open on Christmas. So, I mean, I wasn't in Ecuador on Christmas because I had a break and would come home. But my guess is that those places were not necessarily open because this hadn't been a tradition prior. And because that is a day off, and because everyone in Ecuador, I mean, Ecuador has some small amount of Jewish people, but they're mostly like expats from the US as opposed to like an innate Jewish culture. And so I can't imagine that those places would be open on Christmas. So, I mean, I don't know overall, but my guess is that this is like a pretty significantly American, or places that Americans have gone to since the tradition came out.
Well, I really want to thank you, Naomi, for talking with us today. It was really a lot of fun. And as you say, there are some kind of a bit more serious issues underlying, but it was really a wonderful thing to hear about. I'd never done as deep a dive as you have. And now I want to read Hannah Raskin's thesis. So there you go. Anyway, well, thanks again. And you know, I will happily send out to everyone your website in case people want to follow you in some kind of social media context, or look at what else you've done. So thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome, thank you. Ooh, the link for the program. I don't, that's Neil.
The link for the program, what do you mean?
For this session, the link.
Oh, yes,
Right.
that will be up on our YouTube as long as Naomi's okay with that.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Several people I know weren't able to make it today and would like to see it.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. This was great. Thank you.
Wonderful.
all the
Thank
best.
you guys all.
Yeah, all the best to you in the days ahead.
Thanks so much.
Take
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.